Welcome to the Deep Dive. You're joining us today for, a pretty fascinating journey, I think, into the mind of one of the most influential thinkers of the 19th century.
Definitely influential, and I think still relevant today. We're talking about John Stuart Mill.
Yeah, John Stuart Mill,
Yeah.
a name you hear, and, there are a lot of big ideas connected to it, but sometimes it's hard to remember exactly what all those ideas were.
It can be. He had a lot to say about a lot of things.
Exactly. So in this deep dive, we're going to try to really zero in on the essence of John Stuart Mill.
That's right. And you've assembled quite a collection of material for us to dig into.
Yeah, we've got excerpts from his own writing, which is always the best place to start.
Absolutely got to hear it straight from the source.
Right. And then we also have some analysis and commentary from other thinkers about Mill and his impact. So we'll try to pull out the key insights from all of those.
Sounds good. A multifaceted view of the man and his ideas.
Exactly. So just to give everyone a roadmap of where we're headed, we're going to tackle utilitarianism for sure.
The greatest happiness principle.
Yeah, exactly. But we'll see. There's more to it than just that simple phrase. We'll also delve into his work on logic and how we know what we know.
Epistemology.
There you go. Big word.
Yeah.
Then we'll get into his powerful defense of individual liberty, which I think still resonates so strongly today.
In a world where freedom is constantly being debated and challenged. Absolutely.
Right. And we can't forget his pioneering arguments for women's rights.
Way ahead of his time on that one.
Absolutely. Plus, we'll touch on his economic thinking, and we'll even get a glimpse into his own intellectual development through his autobiography.
Always fascinating to see how a great mind evolved over time.
Yeah, definitely. So think of this deep dive as your express lane to understanding why John Stuart Mill remains such a significant and thought-provoking figure. So let's start with what is probably his most famous idea, utilitarianism.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that Mill wasn't the first utilitarian. He was building on the ideas of Jeremy Bentham.
Okay, yeah. Bentham was all about the greatest happiness for the greatest number, wasn't he?
Exactly. But Mill added a really crucial dimension to it.
Which way?
The quality of happiness, not just the quantity.
I see. So it's not just about how much happiness there is, but what kind of happiness.
Precisely. And he lays this out in his 1861 work, Utilitarianism. He says very clearly that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong, as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And by happiness, he means pleasure and the absence of pain.
Okay, so pleasure and the absence of pain. But he's saying there are different levels of pleasure.
Exactly. He distinguishes between lower pleasures, which are more sensual and bodily, and higher pleasures, which are more intellectual and emotional and moral.
So like a pig might experience a lot of pleasure rolling around in the mud.
Right, and there's nothing wrong with that.
But a human being is capable of experiencing a different kind of pleasure from, say, reading a great book or having a deep conversation.
Exactly. And Mill argues that once we've experienced these higher pleasures, we can no longer be truly satisfied with only the lower ones.
Which leads to that famous line. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied.
It's a powerful image, isn't it? And it really gets at the heart of what Mill is saying. We have these higher faculties as human beings, and we need to exercise them to be truly happy.
Now, another important aspect of utilitarianism is this idea of impartiality.
Right. It's not just about maximizing my own happiness, but the happiness of everyone affected by my actions.
So it's not just about me.
Definitely not. You have to take a more universal perspective. Mill uses the analogy of a disinterested and benevolent spectator. You have to try to see things from a point of view that's not biased by your own personal desires.
That sounds pretty challenging.
It is. But Mill believes it's the only way to make truly moral decisions. And he points out that this idea of impartiality is already present in many of our ethical traditions.
Right.
The Golden Rule, for example. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's about putting yourself in the other person's shoes and considering their happiness as well as your own.
Okay. But there's another objection to utilitarianism that I've heard, which is that it seems very impractical. Like, how can you possibly calculate the consequences of every action before you take it? You'd be paralyzed.
That's a common criticism. And Mill had an answer for it. He said that over the course of human history, we've accumulated a vast amount of experience about the general tendencies of actions.
So we don't have to start from scratch every time we make a decision.
Right. We have moral rules and societal norms that have developed over time, and they generally reflect what tends to promote happiness.
So those rules are like a shortcut.
Exactly. They're based on the collective wisdom of countless generations.
That's a pretty good point. Now, what about the idea of self-sacrifice? Is utilitarianism all about sacrificing your own happiness for the sake of others?
Well, Mill does say that utilitarianism can justify self-sacrifice, but only if it leads to a greater increase in overall happiness.
So it's not about self-sacrifice for its own sake.
No, the key is the net gain in happiness. If sacrificing your own happiness doesn't actually make anyone else happier, then it's not morally justifiable.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I guess there's always the danger that someone could twist utilitarianism to justify doing bad things.
Right. Mill acknowledges that any ethical system can be misapplied, but he argues that utilitarianism at least provides a clear framework for thinking about moral questions.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Mill's contributions to logic and epistemology.
Yeah. His big work here is A System of Logic, published in 1843.
And this is where he lays out his theory of how we know what we know, right?
Exactly. And the core of his theory is what he calls radical empiricism.
Okay. Radical empiricism, that sounds pretty intense.
It is. It's the idea that all knowledge without exception comes from experience.
So we're not born with any innate ideas.
Nope. Everything we know we've learned through our senses.
Wow. So even things like mathematical truths, like 2 + 2 = 4.
Even those. Mill argues that these seemingly self-evident truths are actually generalizations that we've made based on countless experiences.
So we've seen two objects combined with two other objects so many times that we've come to believe that it will always result in 4 objects.
Right. And this process of connecting ideas based on experience is what he calls associationism. It's how our minds build up knowledge over time.
Okay, so experience plus associationism equals knowledge.
Pretty much. And Mill also emphasizes the importance of language in this process. He distinguishes between the connotation of a word, which is its inherent meaning, and its denotation, which is what it refers to in the world.
Okay, so the connotation of dog would be like a furry, 4-legged creature that barks.
Right. And the denotation of dog would be a specific dog, like your neighbor's Labrador Retriever.
Okay, got it. But if all knowledge comes from experience, then doesn't that mean we can never be completely certain about anything?
Well, Mill does acknowledge that induction, which is the process of reasoning from specific experiences to general conclusions, is never foolproof.
Right, because we could always have a new experience that contradicts our previous ones, like that example of the black swan.
Exactly. Europeans had only ever seen white swans, so they assumed all swans were white until they discovered black swans in Australia.
So even a huge amount of consistent experience doesn't guarantee that our conclusion is universally true.
Right. Induction always involves a degree of uncertainty, but Mill also argues that there are certain things we can know with certainty.
Like what?
Our own immediate sensations and feelings. If I feel pain, I know I'm feeling pain. There's no doubt about that.
Okay, that makes sense. So there's a level of certainty to our own subjective experience.
Exactly. That's the foundation of all our knowledge, according to Mill.
Okay, let's move on to another really crucial part of Mill's thought, which is his ideas about liberty and individualism.
His most famous work on this is On Liberty, published in 1859.
And this is where he really makes the case for individual freedom, isn't it?
Yeah. It is. He argues that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others.
So basically, you can do whatever you want as long as you're not hurting anyone else.
That's the basic idea. It's often called the harm principle.
And this applies to both the government and to society as a whole, right?
Exactly. Mill is concerned not just with government tyranny, but also with what he calls the tyranny of the majority.
So even in a democracy, the majority can still oppress the minority.
Absolutely. And he also talks about social tyranny, which is the pressure to conform to social norms, even if they don't make sense to you.
I think we can all relate to that.
Right. And Mill argues that this kind of social pressure can be even more stifling than government oppression because it's harder to escape.
Because it's everywhere you go.
Exactly. And it can really get inside your head and make you doubt your own thoughts and feelings.
So for Mill, individual freedom is not just about being left alone by the government. It's also about being able to think for yourself and live your life according to your own values.
Exactly. And a big part of that is freedom of expression.
Yeah, he was a huge advocate for free speech, wasn't he?
Huge. He believed that the free exchange of ideas is essential for the progress of knowledge and for the health of society as a whole.
Because even if someone's ideas are wrong, they might still have something valuable to contribute to the conversation.
Exactly. And suppressing those ideas just drives them underground and makes them fester.
It's like putting a lid on a boiling pot.
Exactly. You got to let the steam escape.
Otherwise, it explodes.
Right. And Mill argues that this principle of free speech applies even to opinions that are deeply offensive or unpopular.
You can't just silence people you disagree with.
Nope. You have to engage with their ideas and argue against them.
That's the hallmark of a truly free society, isn't it?
It is. And Mill also emphasizes the importance of diversity of character and lifestyles.
Yeah, he's not a fan of conformity.
No, he sees conformity as a threat to individuality and to progress. He famously says that the human faculties of perception, judgment, discriminative feeling, mental activity, and even moral preference are exercised only in making a choice.
So if everyone is just following the crowd, then no one is really thinking for themselves.
Exactly, and that leads to a stagnant society. Mill believes that we need people who are willing to challenge the status quo and experiment with different ways of life.
Because you never know where the next great idea or innovation is going to come from.
Right, and Mill argues that this diversity of character is essential for human happiness. He says it is not by wearing down into uniformity all that is individual in themselves, but by cultivating it and calling it forth within the limits imposed by the rights and interests of others, that human beings become a noble and beautiful object of contemplation.
So a society full of unique individuals is a more beautiful and interesting society.
That's what Mill believed. And he worried about things like state-controlled education, stifling individuality.
Because if everyone is taught the same things and forced to think the same way, then you're not going to get a lot of creativity.
Exactly. Mill believed that the government should provide education, but it should not dictate what people think.
Okay, let's talk about Mill's views on women's rights. He was way ahead of his time on this issue, wasn't he?
He was. And he lays out his arguments in his 1869 work, The Subjection of Women.
And his main argument is that women should have the same rights as men.
Exactly. He argues for perfect equality between the sexes in all areas of life. Social, political, economic.
That was pretty radical for the 19th century.
It was revolutionary. Most people at the time believed that women were naturally inferior to men.
And Mill is saying that's just nonsense.
Exactly. He says that the alleged differences between men and women are mostly the result of social conditioning, not biology.
So women have been taught to be submissive, and men have been taught to be dominant.
Right. And this has created a self-fulfilling prophecy where women are seen as weak and incapable because they've never been given the opportunity to prove otherwise.
And Mill is saying that if women were given the same opportunities as men, they would achieve just as much.
Exactly. He even compares the subjugation of women to slavery.
Wow, that's a pretty strong comparison.
It is. But he's making the point that both are based on the idea that one group of people is inherently superior to another.
And that's just wrong.
Exactly. Mill believes that women are just as capable as men of rational thought and moral judgment.
And he points out that there have been many examples of women who have achieved great things in spite of the obstacles they faced.
Exactly. And he argues that if we really want to know what women are capable of, we need to give them the same opportunities as men.
It's amazing how relevant his arguments still are today.
It is. We're still fighting for gender equality in many areas of life.
But at least we have people like Mill who paved the way. Okay, let's move on to political economy.
Mill's big work in this area is Principles of Political Economy, published in 1848.
And this is where he tries to update Adam Smith's ideas for the 19th century right.
Exactly. He agrees with many of Smith's core principles, but he also offers some important critiques and refinements.
Like what?
Well, one of the key points he makes is that the distribution of wealth in society is not just determined by market forces.
There are other factors at play.
Yes. Things like custom and tradition and government policy all have an impact on who gets what.
So it's not just about letting the invisible hand do its thing.
No. Mill believes that the government has a role to play in regulating the economy and ensuring that everyone has a fair chance to succeed.
So he's not a pure laissez-faire capitalist.
No. He's more of a pragmatist. He
Yeah.
believes in the free market, but he also recognizes that it has its limitations.
So what kind of economic system does he advocate for?
Well, he doesn't really lay out a detailed blueprint, but he does express some ideals. For example, he believes that everyone should have a basic level of economic security.
So no one should be living in poverty.
Right. But he also believes that we should be wary of excessive wealth accumulation. He's worried about the gap between the rich and the poor growing too wide.
Yeah, that's something we're still grappling with today.
Definitely. And Mill also has some interesting things to say about land ownership. He famously observed that landowners grow rich in their sleep because the value of their land goes up even if they don't do anything to improve it.
Interesting. So he's basically saying that the unearned increment in land value should be taxed away.
That's one interpretation. He definitely believes that land ownership should be subject to more scrutiny than other forms of property.
Makes sense. Now, Mill also has some interesting thoughts about taxation in general.
He's opposed to what we would call a graduated income tax, where the rich pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes than the poor.
Really? Why is that?
He believes it discourages people from working hard and being productive. But he's not against all forms of progressive taxation.
So what does he support?
He supports taxing inheritances. He believes that inherited wealth is unearned and that it can lead to inequality.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, another key aspect of Mill's political thought is his emphasis on political rights.
He believes that everyone should have the right to vote and participate in government.
And he sees this as more than just a matter of fairness.
Right. He argues that political participation is essential for the moral and intellectual development of citizens.
It makes people more engaged and responsible.
Exactly. And it forces them to think about the common good, not just their own self-interest.
So he sees democracy as a kind of school for citizenship.
That's a good way to put it.
And he also believes that power should be accountable to the people.
Absolutely. He says that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant.
Wow, that's a powerful statement.
It is. It really gets at the heart of Mill's liberalism.
Now, Mill was a very moral person. He had a strong sense of right and wrong.
He did. And he believed that morality was essential for a good society. He famously said that it is not because men's desires are strong that they act ill, it is because their consciences are weak.
So he's saying that people know the difference between right and wrong, but they often choose to do the wrong thing because they lack the willpower to resist temptation.
Exactly. And he believed that it was important to cultivate a strong conscience in people.
Through education.
Yes, through education, but also through the example of others.
So good role models are important.
Absolutely. And he also believed that a good society needs a shared set of values.
Like honesty and fairness.
Yes, those are important, but also a sense of justice and a commitment to the common good.
So it's not enough for everyone to just be pursuing their own individual happiness.
No. We need to think about the well-being of society as a whole.
Okay. Now, Mill was writing in the 19th century when democracy was still a relatively new idea.
Yeah.
Did he believe in democracy?
Yes and no. He saw the rise of democracy as inevitable, and he thought it was important for liberals to engage with it.
But he also had some reservations.
Yes. He was worried about the tyranny of the majority, and he thought that democracy could lead to mediocrity if it wasn't done right.
So what did he think was the best way to do democracy?
He was a big advocate for proportional representation.
Which means that the number of seats a party gets in parliament should be proportional to the number of votes they get.
Exactly. That way minority views are still represented.
That makes sense. Now, Mill also had some interesting things to say about war.
He was generally against war, but he recognized that there are times when it might be necessary.
Like if you're being attacked by another country.
Yes, or if you're trying to prevent a genocide. But he was very clear that war should always be a last resort. And he was very critical of wars that were fought for selfish or imperialistic reasons. He said, war is an ugly thing, but not the ugliest of things. The decayed and degraded state of moral and patriotic feeling, which thinks that nothing is worth war, is much worse.
I see. So he's saying that there are things worth fighting for.
Exactly. But we should choose our battles carefully.
Now, I want to talk about something that I think is really interesting about Mill, which is his own personal intellectual journey. He went through a period of deep depression when he was young, didn't he?
He did. It's often referred to as his mental crisis. He describes it in his autobiography.
And what caused it?
Well, he had been raised on this very strict intellectual diet of utilitarianism and classical economics.
By his father, James Mill, who was a pretty formidable intellect himself.
Right. And for a while, John Stuart really bought into it. He thought that reason and logic were the keys to happiness.
But then he hit a wall.
Yeah. He realized that even if he achieved all of his goals, it wouldn't necessarily make him happy.
So he had a kind of existential crisis.
Exactly. And he went into a deep depression.
How did he get out of it?
Well, he started reading romantic poetry, Wordsworth in particular.
Really? That seems like a pretty big shift from Bentham and Ricardo.
It was. But he found that poetry spoke to his emotions in a way that philosophy and economics didn't.
So he realized that there was more to life than just reason and logic.
Exactly. He needed to cultivate his feelings as well.
And did this change his thinking about utilitarianism?
I think it did. He still believed in the greatest happiness principle, but he came to see that happiness was more complex than he had initially thought. It wasn't just about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. It was also about living a life that was meaningful and fulfilling.
That makes sense. Now, another important influence on Mill's thinking was Harriet Taylor.
Yes, she was his intellectual partner and soulmate. They had a very close relationship for many years.
And she really challenged him intellectually, didn't she?
She did. She was a brilliant thinker in her own right, and she pushed Mill to develop his ideas further.
And they eventually got married.
Yes, after Harriet's first husband died.
And she had a big impact on his work on women's rights.
Absolutely. She was a feminist before the word even existed.
So Mill's ideas about gender equality were shaped in part by his relationship with a strong and independent woman.
Definitely, and I think that's important to remember. Now, another thing I find interesting about Mill's intellectual journey is that he was very critical of the idea of innate ideas.
Innate ideas?
Yeah, the idea that we're born with certain knowledge already implanted in our minds.
Like Plato's theory of forms?
Exactly. But Mill rejected this idea. He believed that all knowledge comes from experience.
So he's a thoroughgoing empiricist.
Exactly. And he thought that the belief in innate ideas was actually harmful because it prevented people from questioning their beliefs.
Because if you think that you already know something, then you're not going to bother to investigate it.
Right. And Mill believed that it was essential to always be open to new evidence and to revising your beliefs in light of new information.
That's a very scientific approach.
It is, and it's a key part of Mill's liberalism. He believed that progress depends on our willingness to challenge the status quo and to think for ourselves.
Okay. Finally, I want to touch briefly on Mill's views on religion. He wasn't a religious person, was he?
No. He was an agnostic. He didn't believe that we could know for sure whether or not God exists.
And he wasn't afraid to say so.
No. He was very critical of organized religion, and he thought that it often did more harm than good.
But he didn't dismiss the idea of religion altogether.
No. He recognized that religion could be a source of comfort and meaning for people, but he thought that it was important to keep religion separate from government.
So no state-sponsored religion.
Right. He believed in freedom of conscience, and he thought that everyone should be free to believe whatever they want as long as they don't harm others.
So that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the mind of John Stuart Mill.
It's been a journey.
It has. And I think we've covered a lot of ground. We've seen how Mill's ideas about utilitarianism, liberty, women's rights, and political economy are still relevant today.
They are, and I think the key takeaway is that Mill was a champion of individual freedom and a believer in the power of reason and progress.
And he was always willing to challenge the status quo and to think for himself. So for you, the listener, if you're interested in exploring these ideas further, I highly recommend checking out Mill's own writings.
They're challenging, but they're also incredibly rewarding, and they offer a lot of food for thought.
And one final thought for you to consider. Mill believed that a good society is one that allows individuals to flourish and to develop their talents to the fullest. How do you think we can create such a society in the 21st century? What are the challenges and what are the opportunities?
That's something for all of us to think about.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.